Welcome to the Startup Grind.
I thought what I would do for the first half hour is just talk about some things from my research that I haven't written a lot about before, with the hope that that would be useful. And then I think you're going to interview me and skewer me, which will be fun. The reason why I'm looking like this is if I didn't have a shirt and tie, I just wouldn't be Harvard. And so yeah, that's who I am. This is a model of how bodies of understanding emerge that are quite, that you see this pattern over and over in industry after industry. And let me describe it in the context of the organic chemical industry. So 80 years ago, if you needed to have a new molecule, there were only 50 or so people in the whole world who could synthesize these molecules, and DuPont employed almost all of them. And these people were deeply experienced. They were the best in the world, and when they needed to develop a new molecule, they would just reach deep and pull out all of the intuition and education they could and try to synthesize something. And then they'd go down they'd mix up a few atoms in a beaker and spin it into a fiber, take it down, knock on a colleague's door and say, "What do you think I just invented?" And the colleague would say, "I have no idea what you invented, but bring it in, let's heat it up for 10 more minutes and see what happens." And the molecules, the miracle molecules that we call today nylon, polyester, acetate, Kevlar, and so on, emerged from DuPont's labs through what was essentially a trial and error problem-solving process. And only the best in the world could play in that game. But as these artists practiced their craft over the subsequent few decades, patterns began to emerge. And when organic chemistry moved from a trial and error realm into a pattern recognition realm, it allowed people to start to teach other people how to build these molecules. And there was no handbook yet or toolkit, but there were patterns. And you were able to tell your students, if you do this, there's a higher probability that that's going to happen than this is going to happen. And so you didn't have to be the smartest in the world to play in this game. So a lot more people started to study organic chemistry, and a lot more companies got into the fibers business. And then, more recently, theories began to be well understood and applied, like quantum theory and rate theory. And as these theories, which are statements of causality, emerged in the industry, you could predict in advance, if I do this, this will be the result. And when that understanding of cause and effect emerged, then you could build models that would allow you to know in advance whether or not a particular molecule could be built, and if you built it, what its properties would be. And so today, if you need a new molecule, really all you have to have is a BS in Chem E from a state school and a great piece of software, and you can build better molecules faster and at lower cost than could the world's best scientists a couple of generations ago. But the progress of knowledge from trial and error problem-solving process into a pattern recognition realm, and now ultimately into a rules-based realm, has been a blessing to mankind. So before you go to bed at night, Just stand in the room that you're sleeping in and turn around 360 degrees. You'll be able to put your fingers or your eyes on at least a dozen different fibers that have been just an unmitigated blessing in your life in terms of their quality, reliability, cost, performance, durability. But these blessings did not come from replicating the intuition of DuPont scientists, but it's come from commoditizing their understanding through scientific progress. Now, the same thing is going on in medicine. Historically, and even is the case today, if you have a problem, you go to the finest doctor you can find. And they'll just reach in and pull out the deepest experience and intuition and education and have to treat every patient as if they're different. And we really historically have been in medicine's equivalent of intuitive medicine. But as these people have practiced their craft, patterns have emerged. And you might call that empirical medicine or best practices medicine, where you can see patterns in things. And we're not yet to a point where it's rules-based in many diseases. But the more we can move from trial and error intuition medicine into best practices medicine to ultimately to precision or rules-based medicine, we will have higher quality at lower cost. Now, I think venture capital historically has been very much in the realm of intuitive medicine, in that there has been a deep belief that you just can't predict in advance what's going to work and what isn't going to work and why. And so I think most venture capitalists still believe as if the world is unpredictable. And they just have to reach deeply and pull up their best experience and intuition and apply that intuition to every potential investment and do the things that just in their gut make sense. And in my mind, I'm thinking that entrepreneurship actually does not need to be in the trial and error stage anymore. That there really is a lot that is in a pattern recognition realm. So it's not, there's no cookbook that guarantees if I do this, I'll be successful. But there really are important patterns to see. And some of my best friends are venture capitalists. But I think as a group, there are fewer venture capitalists who have read any of my research than any other group of mankind. And I think it's because they are so convinced that it still is in the realm of intuitive medicine, that it actually, they already know everything that's in the research. And I wanted to just talk through some of the things that I think are components of a pattern to look for, so that you have a much higher degree of probability that if I account for these patterns in what I do, I will be successful. So I think the piece of my work that is most known is the theory of disruption. I remember when Andy Grove gave a big talk here at what we call the Academy of Management. This is all of the business school professors show up. And Andy Grove was their keynote speaker. And Grove organized his whole talk around disruption. And it was it was a lucky thing for me because I was just coming up for tenure at Harvard, and Andy Grove stood up and said, this is a good theory. And so it kind of made my day. But he said, I think, and he pointed at me, this point to me, he said, you shouldn't call it disruption. He said, you ought to call it the Christensen Effect or something like that, because the word disruption has so many connotations in the English language that people will stop short of learning what the theory really says, and they'll just attach the word disruption to everything. And I couldn't call it the Christensen Effect, so I kept calling it disruption, but it turns out that Grove was exactly right. I think everybody uses the word disruption. Very few of them really understand what it means because they haven't studied it deeply at all. But the idea of disruption allows you to predict. It is a theory that allows you to predict what the competition will do in response to what you do. And it allows you to predict whether you will kill the incumbents or whether the incumbents will kill you. And that's really all that the theory of disruption allows you to do. It's a theory about competitive response to what you do. And it essentially says that in the pursuit of profit, generation after generation, companies and industries make better and better and better products. And what the theory says is if you think you can win by introducing a better product that you could sell for better profits to the best customers of the leader in the industry, they will always kill you. But if you come in at the bottom of a market and introduce products that actually aren't as good as what the leaders are making, and then keep moving up from the bottom, in the pursuit of profit, it creates a situation where the leading industry will flee up market rather than fight you. And therefore, if you want to be sure that you kill the competitor rather than competitors kill you, you should always go to the bottom of the market as like you're a young boy, and you can kill the giant because the giant is motivated to flee rather than fight. And if you go back into the successful companies in the valley, literally every one went to the bottom of the market and went up. And so that's what the theory is and isn't. It's just a theory to predict what the competitors will do in response to what you do. And that's actually quite important if you want to succeed. And therefore, a pattern to look for is it truly disruptive? Now, the second element or pattern that has emerged from our research relates to, so if I've got disruption right, which means I don't need to worry about the competitors coming after us, what customers should I focus on? And there really is another theory about this that's quite important that a lot of people just don't acknowledge. And this applies generally when science is at work. And the answer of this is that if this is a manifestation of new technology, you should never go after an established market, but instead you need to compete against non-consumption. And let me give you a story from the history of electronics. When the transistor emerged to disrupt the vacuum tube industry. And this began in the late 40s. And all the way up through the early 1970s, almost all consumer electronics products were made with vacuum tube technology. And vacuum tubes were the size of a child's fist. In a television, there were about 20 to 25 vacuum tubes, and they were complicated and expensive, and so that a television was about like this, cost in today's dollars about $4,000. And so really only the rich and the people who have big apartments or larger homes could have a television and use it. They sucked a lot of power and emanated a lot of heat. The transistor, when it emerged, was a disruptive technology in that it couldn't be used in products that existed because the transistor couldn't handle the power required to make a radio or a television with it. So every one of the companies that made vacuum tubes, these are the industry's giants like RCA and General Electric and Zenith and Westinghouse. They took a license for the technology from Bell Labs, but then they carried the license into their own labs and they framed it as a technological problem. In other words, the transistor isn't good enough to be used in the market, and so in today's money, they invested over $3 billion trying to make the transistor good enough that you could use it in the floor-standing televisions and the radios that sat on the crescenda in your home. In 1955, Sony came out with the first commercial transistor product, and it was a crummy little pocket radio that cost $2. And it was a crummy product. It was filled with static, a tinny sound. But Sony sold this $2 radio to the rebar of humanity, people we call teenagers. And it enabled teenagers to do something that previously wasn't possible, and that is they could have their own source of music, and they could listen to rock and roll out of the earshot of their parents. And because this was infinitely better than nothing, the customers were delighted with that product. My brother and I emptied our bank accounts, came up with $2, bought one of these things. I was raised in Salt Lake. And I remember we had to face west to the Great Salt Lake in order to get reception. But we were thrilled because it was infinitely better than nothing. And our mother, who had a lovely RCA radio, she measured quality by the sound. And we didn't care about the sound. What mattered to us is personal convenience and the ability to take radio wherever we wanted. And then in 1959, Sony introduced the world's first portable television. And again, it was a very limited product. But at $99, it was so much cheaper than anything else that a whole new population of people now had access to television. And because it was infinitely better than nothing, their customers were delighted. And then competing against non-consumption, Sony and its competitors just made better and better and better products until by the middle 1960s, you could make with solid-state electronics big televisions and big radios. And over the next 5 years, you just heard this as the customers were sucked out of the vacuum tube world into the solid-state world. And every one of the vacuum tube companies evaporated. But they did it because the established companies tried to make the product good enough that it could be used in the existing market. And in order to make that work, solid-state electronics had to be better than vacuum tube technology. And through the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, that was a very onerous barrier that they had to overcome. And Sony, by competing against non-consumption, all they had to do was make a product that is better than nothing. And so when you have a new product, it's actually really important that the kind of customers you target are people whose other option is nothing at all. And that way they'll be thrilled with a limited product. And you think about what's happened in electronic vehicles, battery-powered vehicles today. And there's a company out here called Tesla. Who knows whether they'll be successful or not. But what the theory says is, holy cow, for us to win, that means it has to be competitive on the California freeways. And we're competing against the best cars in the world. And it's very demanding. And so they come up with cars that, in fact, do compete reasonably well, and they cost $100,000, and God bless them. But if you really want to make a big market instead of a niche market, the kind of question that you want to ask for electric vehicles is, geez, I wonder if there is a market out there, customers, who would just love to have a product that won't go very far or go very fast. You ask the question, and the answer is obvious, and that is the parents of teenagers in suburbia. The parents of teenagers would love to have a car that won't go very far or go very fast. And they will just cruise around the neighborhood. They can drive it to school, see their friends, come home, pull it in overnight. And because they're competing against non-consumption, a new class of humanity have access to cars. And then in that context, it'll get better and better and better. Or electronic, solar electricity. Where is the best market for solar electricity? Well, we would think that in America and Europe and Japan, where we consume a lot of electricity, this would be the best market for solar electricity. But when you think about the standards that you have to surmount in order to be an economically viable institution, the grid is 99.9999875% reliable. And if you're making solar electricity, you've got problems, like night happens every day. Clouds get in the way. And we are about 7 years away from cost competitiveness with power over the grid. But we have been 7 years away for 45 years, and we're still 7 years away. And so companies in electricity in America that try to build a business around solar energy just rely on subsidies and subsidies and subsidies and subsidies. Our daughter Anne served as a missionary for the LDS Church in Korea, in Mongolia for a couple of years. And when she was done, she invited us to come over to give us a tour of Mongolia. And while we were in the capital of Ulaanbaatar, she took us to this massive open-air bazaar. And we happened upon a set of vendors who were selling dirt-cheap solar panels that were shrink-wrapped with 6-inch black and white televisions and rabbit ears antennas. And these things are moving out of the market like you can't believe. Well, it turns out that about half the population of Mongolia are non-consumers of electricity. And solar energy is infinitely better than no electricity at all. And who cares that it was cloudy today? We couldn't watch TV yesterday. And a booming new market is emerging in the 2 billion people in Africa and Asia who have no access to electricity at all. And so the theory would tell you that if you have a new technology, such as solar electricity or electronic vehicles, if you try to sell this into established markets, the competition is very stiff. Instead, if you compete against non-consumption, develop products that are infinitely better than nothing, and use that as your launching pad, the probability that you'll succeed is much higher. So these are just two theories. One is how to beat the competitors, which is disruption. What I've described here is competing against non-consumption. The third one is, now, how can I be sure, so Clay, I got it right, compete against non-consumption, disrupt them, but how do I know whether the customer is actually going to buy my product or not? And there's another technology or a theory that has been very useful that we call a job to be done. And let me describe what we mean by a job to be done. Here I am, Clay Christensen, and as you can tell, I have attributes. I turned 60, unfortunately. I'm 6'8", unfortunately. We just sent our youngest daughter back to college, unfortunately. You know, I have all of these characteristics and attributes, but these characteristics have not yet caused me to buy the New York Times this morning. There might be a correlation between my characteristics and the propensity to buy the New York Times, but my characteristics don't cause me to buy it. And what causes us to buy a product or a service is, you know, darn it, stuff happens to us every day. Jobs arise in our lives that we need to get done. And when we have a job to do, we then try to find something that we could buy or hire and pull it in our lives to get the job done. And what's important about this is so much of marketing that was taught to you and me is correlative in character. And they can say that there's a X% probability that customers would prefer this rather than that. But understanding the cause of purchase really improves the probability of success to a much higher level. Let me just try to give you a silly example of this. Some of you might have heard this on a video or something. But one of the big fast food restaurant chains was trying to figure out how to sell more of their milkshakes. And these guys were very sophisticated marketing people. And so they actually had a profile of the quintessential milkshake customer. And people who fit that profile, they'd pull into conference rooms and they'd ask them, how could we improve the milkshake so you buy more of them? And these are very sophisticated consumers, and so they give very sophisticated answers about how they can improve it. And then the company would improve it on those dimensions, and it had no impact on sales or profits whatsoever. So a couple of colleagues and I decided we need to understand what causes people to buy milkshakes. In other words, is there a job out there needing to be done, which when people have the job to do, it caused them to hire a milkshake. So one of my colleagues stood in a restaurant for 18 hours and just took very careful notes about what time did they buy a milkshake, what was he wearing, was he with other people alone, did they eat it in the restaurant or leave? And it turned out that about half the milkshakes were sold in the very early morning. It was the only thing they bought. They were always alone, and they always got in the car and drove off with it. So the next day, to figure out what was the job they were trying to do, they positioned themselves outside the restaurant and confronted these people as they emerged with this milkshake in their hand. And in language that they could understand, essentially would ask, I got a big problem with what you're doing. What job were you trying to do that caused you to come here at 6:30 to hire a milkshake? And as they would struggle to answer the question, to try to help them, they'd say, well, think about the last time you were in the same situation, needing to get the same job done, but you didn't come here to hire a milkshake. What did you hire? And it turned out they all had the same job to do. And that is, they had a long and boring drive to work. And they just needed something to do while they were driving to keep awake. One hand had to be on the wheel, but geez, somebody gave me another hand and there isn't anything in it. And I'm not hungry yet, but I know I'll be hungry by 10 o'clock, so I need something that will just thunk down in my stomach and sit there. Geez, what do I hire when I have this job to do? And one guy said, yeah, I hired a banana last Friday to do the job, but take my word for it, never hire bananas. They're always gone in 2.5 minutes. And another one said, don't tell my wife, but I hired donuts to do the job a couple times a week, but gee, they make my fingers gooey. They crumb all over my clothes. Yeah, I do bagels occasionally, but they're so dry and tasteless. I have to steer the car with my knees while they put the cream cheese on. And then if the phone rings, I'm in real trouble. Another said, I hired a Snickers to do the job, but I felt so guilty. I've never hired Snickers again. But let me tell you, when I come here and hire this milkshake, it's so viscous. It takes me 25 minutes to suck it up that thin little straw. Who knows what the ingredients are? I don't care. I just know that I'm full all morning. And actually, if I run into trouble, I can turn it sideways and it doesn't fall out. And it turns out that the milkshake does the job better than any of the competitors. And the competitors are not Burger King milkshakes, but it's bananas, donuts, bagels, Snickers bars, boredom, coffee, and other things. And the important thing from this is that we had thought that the customer is the wrong is what we need to understand. And now we realize that the customer is the wrong unit of analysis, because the fact that it's a person doesn't cause them to buy anything. But understanding the job the customer is trying to do is what we really need to understand. Because if we understand the job, then we can design a product that nails the job perfectly. And so it's another theory that is really well practiced in certain circles in entrepreneurship, that if you understand the job they're trying to do and develop a product that will get the job done, the probability that they will then pull it in their lives is much higher, because this is the causal mechanism behind a decision. Let me just say one other thing that I think is known in a pattern recognition realm. And then I'd love to have you come and skewer me. Yeah, I think that venture capital itself needs to be disrupted. And if I go back in history, what's been going on is I started my first company in 1984. And that was the very year that Mitt Romney and his friends created Bain Capital. About a year later, Mitt Romney called me up out of the blue. And he said, Clay, you may have heard we started a venture capital firm called Bain Capital. And we put about $1 million in a piddly little company called Staples. They just got an office just up the river from the Harvard Business School. Do you guys buy furniture or stationery for your company, Clay? And I said, we got about 40 people, and there's a distributor in Lowell, Massachusetts that and he said, would you mind, just as a friend, don't buy it from them anymore, but just go to Staples and buy it? And so I said, sure, if you're a friend, I'll do it. So Mitt Romney of Bain Capital found it in his interest to call a friend who had 40 employees and ask him to buy at Staples. Well, Staples became somewhat successful. And about 18 months later, Bain raised their second fund, 10x as much money as they had in the first round, and it closed in 2.5 hours. So shortly after that, a friend of mine called and said, I got a great idea. It's in another industry, but it's a lot like Staples. Do you know anybody who would be interested in this? And I said, well, I got a friend, Mitt Romney, that funded Staples not many years ago, and I bet he'd be interested. So my friend called Mitt, explained what it does. How much are you trying to raise? My friend said, about $1 million. And Mitt said, we don't do things like that. It's got to be at least 10 million or we can't look at it. And I realized what was happening, of course, is that on the diagram of disruption, at the high end of the market is bigger deals, and smaller deals are at the low end of the market, and bigger deals are more profitable than small deals. And so what used to be attractive to Bain Capital wasn't attractive anymore. They had become an early stage venture to a late stage venture, and then they kept moving into private equity, and then you know what they become now. And so this is happening at venture capital. They're always wanting to go up market. And it's like they bewail the rhyme of the ancient mariner. There's water, water everywhere, and not enough, and not a drop to drink. Because the people at the end of private equity complain that they have so much capital and so few deals. And entrepreneurs trying to raise money at the low end, they can't get funding because of this mismatch that's going on. And I think that there's well, maybe I've talked on too long. Do you want to come up here? And if you want to ask me about how you guys are going to get disrupted, I'll bring it up then.